I decided I wanted to try to make a video about the way the discussion around mass shootings happens as it relates to mental illness. And the reason I want to do that is that I am a person who lives with a mental illness. I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety very young, and it turned out many years later that diagnosis really should have been PTSD. So I have spent 35 of my 45 years on the planet living with PTSD. So this is not a discussion that I want to have as a hobby. It's not a leisure activity for me. It is not amusing. It's a thing that affects my life directly. Mental illness has negatively affected every aspect of my life. And so every time that we get brought up in relation to these mass shootings, what happens is that essentially the responsibility is getting put on people with mental illness, especially by conservatives. And there's no evidence to support that targeting people with mental illness as the way to prevent mass shootings is going to be successful. It's not going to prevent many mass shootings. The FBI did a study of 63 different shootings from 2000 to 2013, and they found that in 25% of those instances, the individual who committed the shootings had been diagnosed with a mental illness prior to committing those shootings. Now, even though 25% of them had been diagnosed prior, only in 3 of those cases was mental illness found to be the cause of the shootings. Now, you can focus on mental illness as a way to try to stop mass shootings, but given that evidence, it seems like just another instance of what we've seen so much of, which is people in government attempting to do the absolute least they could possibly do to solve a problem. The other thing about the way that they talk about us is that there is already a stigma surrounding mental illness. And there are some ways that you can find evidence of that stigma. One of them is that we are 16 times more likely to be killed in interaction with police than people who don't have a mental illness. The other is that our life expectancy is 15 to 20 years shorter than people without mental illness. And another is that we have much higher rates of poverty than people without mental illness. Now, if there wasn't a stigma, if the rest of society saw people with mental illness as being the same or equal to the rest of you, none of that would be acceptable. But it is acceptable, and it has been acceptable for a very long time. So that stigma already exists. And part of the reason that stigma exists is because people are afraid of us. The way that we're portrayed in a lot of media, and the way that we come up in any kind of in almost any kind of discussion around public health, is from the perspective of people with mental illness being a danger. Even though we are far more likely to be victims of every kind of crime, but violent crime as well, than we are to be perpetrators, that's kind of still the perspective that the public has of us. We get represented in media, so movies, television, things like that, as being monstrous. You don't really ever see a person who has a mental illness just kind of living. You don't even see the person who's the best friend and just happens to also have a mental illness and be living with it and existing with it, in a way that's stable and, isn't a threat. So the way that the public perceives us is as a threat. And when the conservatives turn to putting the responsibility of mass shootings on us, it contributes to that stigma. Now, when we look at the fact that politicians have done nothing where gun control is concerned, and that means that we have continued to have school shootings, and we take into account the fact that there is this stigma against people with mental illness already, it paints a pretty grim picture. The Washington Post has kept a database of the number of children who've been affected by gun violence in their schools since Columbine. That number is around 311,000. Now, we also know that the lockdowns that happen that are taken as a preventative measure when schools think there might be someone who is intending on threatening a school have also been a source of trauma for a lot of school children. So we know then that there are lots of kids out there who are walking around with the trauma from gun violence or from the lockdowns, and they're going to be experiencing adverse mental health effects as a result of that. Now, in combination with the stigma that we already have, that means that this gun violence is then also contributing to the number of people in the country who have and deal with mental illnesses, and then they are going to be coming out of school and going into school and dealing with that stigma already. So listening to this Republican talking point, to this conservative distraction campaign, and focusing on people who have mental illness is just going to make things worse, because it makes that stigma worse. And we are not contributing the majority of these mass shootings. We're not even contributing the majority of gun violence. So this is something that I understand we're all very passionate about. It is something that obviously is horrific. We have these mass shootings that keep happening on top of the more standard gun violence, which is, it's insane to even think of that as a concept, like our normal gun violence, right? And then, so we're everybody is very exercised, and we're all very passionate about solving the problem. But we need to be careful about not putting people with mental illnesses on the hook for something that we are not responsible for. Because that's what they're trying to do. And it's not only a distraction from the actual problem and actually instituting some kind of effective gun control, it then makes the stigma against people with mental illnesses worse. And when you consider the fact that mental illnesses affect people across every population, then you end up in the kind of situation where it's making it worse for people who are then stigmatized in more than one way, who are facing discrimination in more than one way. We know that LGBTQ youth have a higher rate of death by suicide than the rest of us. And we know it's because they already are facing discrimination for being LGBTQ. Now, if you add in discrimination because they're dealing with mental illness related to that, then what are you doing? Why are you adding to that stigma? And so, we need to keep that in mind, to keep that kind of thing in mind, and not just rush and let the compromised position be that it's going to put people with mental illnesses on the hook for something that we are not responsible for.